When did an action become your greatest regret on stage? I still replay that night in my head over and over, sometimes 20 times before the sun comes up. It's always the same, the stage light searing my old eyes, the terrible groan, and then the sickening thud that echoed through the nearly empty theater. And me, Sebastian Green, 64M, standing there frozen, a guilty bystander who saw it all unfold but did nothing, absolutely nothing, when every fiber of my being screamed for action. The moral rod of it has clung to me like a stage costume left too long in the damp, smelling of old sweat and regret. I suppose I have to start at the beginning, though the end often feels like the only part that matters now. For years, it'd been the unsung hero of the local community theater, the Lamplight Players, a place where passion often outstripped professionalism, and enthusiasm usually compensated for a lack of proper funding. My official title was Technical Director, which mostly meant I was the guy who fixed everything, from temperamental spotlights to squeaky stage doors, and occasionally even the actors' egos. It was a comfortable routine, a familiar rhythm of rehearsals, build-outs, and opening nights. The air always smelled of sawdust, old paint, and the faint, hopeful scent of ambition. It was home. We were in the thick of rehearsals for our next big production, an ambitious, slightly overwrought period drama called Whispers of the Gilded Age. It was an odd choice for our modest stage, requiring elaborate sets and a cast that numbered more than half our usual subscription base. The director, a perpetually flustered woman named Alina, had been campaigning for this play for years, convinced it would put us on the regional theater map. I just saw a lot of extra work. The biggest challenge, aside from the sheer scale, was the casting of the lead female role, the tragic ingenue Eliza. Our usual leading lady had pulled out at the last minute with a sudden artistic difference. Read, better offer from a professional touring company, leaving Alina in a panic. That's when Julie Murphy, 53F, swept in. She wasn't new to our theater. She'd done a few smaller roles years ago, always with a certain flair, but she'd been off the radar, apparently pursuing some sort of vague business venture in the city. Her return was heralded by a whirlwind of effusive compliments and an almost alarming eagerness to reconnect with her artistic roots. Julie was, to put it mildly, striking. She carried herself with an almost regal bearing, her silver hair often meticulously styled, her voice a low, melodious purr that could charm the paint off a prop. She had this way of making eye contact that felt incredibly intimate, as if you were the only person in the room, even if she was speaking to a crowd of 30. Alina, desperate for a lead, was putty in her hands. Within an hour of her initial audition, where she delivered an admittedly powerful monologue, she had the role. "Sebastian, darling, you simply must tell me how you managed to keep this place running," Julie had purred at me during her first tech rehearsal, her fingers lightly touching my arm. "It's a miracle, truly. The lighting, the sound, it's all so precise." I mumbled something about hard work and a good team. She just smiled, her eyes crinkling at the corners, and I felt that familiar, uneasy warmth that she seemed to effortlessly generate in everyone around her. It was a charm offensive, pure and simple, and I, like most others, found myself disarmed, if not entirely convinced. I'd seen her type before, all flash and little substance beneath the surface, but I was wrong about her in so many ways. The truth was, Julie had a knack for identifying exactly what people wanted to hear and then delivering it with impeccable timing. Alina wanted praise for her vision, the younger actors wanted encouragement, and even the prickly stage manager Brenda found herself softening under Julie's constant stream of thoughtful questions about cues and scene changes. She seemed genuinely interested in everyone, asking about families, hobbies, even health, and somehow remembered every detail. It was impressive, almost too impressive. Rehearsals were chaotic as always. The Lamplight Players operated on a shoestring budget, which meant many of the props were repurposed, the costumes slightly frayed, and the sets prone to unexpected wobbles. My biggest headache was the central piece of the Gilded Age set, a grand spiral staircase meant to evoke the opulence of a turn-of-the-century mansion. It was beautiful, yes, but also unwieldy, a monster of painted plywood and repurposed banisters that had seen better days. It warned Alina multiple times about its stability, especially with the weight of actors on it. "Just make sure it's secure, Sebastian," Shed sighed, waving a dismissive hand. "We don't have time for a redesign." One evening, about 2 weeks before opening night, we were running a particularly difficult scene involving Eliza Julie descending the staircase in a dramatic flourish, only to collapse at the bottom in a fit of despair. It was a crucial moment, demanding both grace and a convincing breakdown. We'd rehearsed it endlessly. This particular run was meant to be a full costume and lighting test, the first time all the elements came together. The theater was mostly empty, save for Alina, Brenda, a few crew members, and me. I was up in the lighting booth, adjusting a spot that was stubbornly refusing to hit its mark. Down below, Julie was taking her mark at the top of the precarious staircase. She was wearing a heavy flowing gown that shimmered under the stage lights, looking every bit the tragic heroine. "Lights, Sebastian," Alina called up, her voice echoing. "On it, Alina," I replied, my eyes glued to the controls. I adjusted the dimmer, bringing up the intensity. The stage glowed. "Music cue from Brenda, please." A melancholic piano melody filled the theater. Julie began her slow descent, her hand trailing along the banister, her gaze fixed dramatically on some unseen point beyond the footlights. She was doing well, really. Her performance was always meticulous. That's when he walked in. Caleb Williams, 85M. I'd seen him around the theater before, mostly during rehearsals for previous plays. He was an enigma. He didn't seem to be part of the cast or crew, never offered to help, never spoke much. He just appeared. Sometimes he'd sit in the back row, watching quietly. Sometimes he'd be sketching in a small notebook in the lobby. He was an old man, frail-looking, with wisps of white hair and a deep-set gaze that seemed to hold a lifetime of secrets. His clothes were always simple, nondescript, and he carried himself with a peculiar stillness, as if he were trying not to disturb the air around him. The other crew members sometimes joked he was a ghost, or maybe a retired spy. I just thought he was a lonely old man with an appreciation for theater and a bit of a habit of showing up unannounced. He certainly wasn't on any guest list for a tech rehearsal. He walked in through the main door, which was technically supposed to be locked, and stood just inside the back of the auditorium, his eyes fixed on the stage. He didn't make a sound, but I saw him from my perch in the booth. Usually I'd have called down to Alina about an unauthorized person, but he was so quiet, so unassuming that I just let it slide, my attention still on the lights and Julie's descent. Maybe he was with someone. Maybe Alina had invited him. My mind raced with trivial explanations rather than confronting the mild breach of protocol. Julie was halfway down the staircase now, her performance building. The music swelled. She looked up, her expression a perfect blend of heartbreak and defiance, and her eyes for a split second met mine in the booth, or so I thought. In that same instant something shifted. I wasn't quite sure what it was, but her movement faltered just for a breath. Her eyes flickered away from me towards the back of the house, towards where Caleb stood. And then it happened. One of the steps, which I had personally shored up with extra bracing that very morning, gave way with a splintering crack that sounded like a gunshot in the hushed theater. It wasn't a total collapse, just enough to throw Julie off balance. She gasped a small choked sound, her hands flailing for the banister. Her heavy costume, designed for dramatic effect, became a terrible burden tangling around her legs. She pitched forward headfirst down the remaining half-dozen steps. The thud was sickening. A collective gasp rose from the few people in the house. Alina shrieked. Brenda dropped her cue sheet. I was still in the booth, staring, my heart leaping into my throat. Julie lay crumpled at the bottom of the staircase, her limbs splayed at an unnatural angle, the shimmering fabric of her gown pooling around her like spilled blood. Julie, oh my God, Julie. Alina was rushing forward, tripping over her own feet. But before anyone else moved, Caleb Williams did. He was surprisingly swift for an old man, moving from the back row with an urgency that belied his age. He reached Julie first, kneeling beside her. I watched, mesmerized and horrified, as he gently turned her onto her back. Her eyes were open, unfocused. A thin trickle of blood snaked from the corner of her mouth. Someone call an ambulance, Alina cried, her voice cracking. Caleb, however, didn't seem to be listening. He ignored Alina, ignored Brenda, ignored the burgeoning panic. His gaze was fixed on Julie's face. He reached out a trembling hand and with an almost tender reverence brushed a stray lock of silver hair from her forehead. And then he did something that chilled me to the bone. He didn't check for a pulse, he didn't assess her injuries. He just stared at her, his lips moving almost imperceptibly as if he were whispering something. His face, usually so impassive, contorted into an expression I couldn't quite decipher: grief, recognition. Something far more profound than the immediate crisis suggested. Brenda was already on the phone, her voice shaking as she relayed the address. Alina was hovering, wringing her hands, tears starting to stream down her face. Julie, can you hear me? Speak to me, Julie. Caleb finally spoke, his voice surprisingly clear in the suddenly silent theater. It's not Julie, he said, not to anyone in particular, but to the air, to the fallen woman, to the very stage itself. Eyes though were fixed on the woman's face, a look of profound sorrow on his own. It's not her. Alina whirled around, confused. What are you talking about? Of course it's Julie. What kind of sick joke is this? Caleb didn't respond. He just knelt there, his hand still gently resting on the fallen woman's cheek, his gaze unwavering. He looked like a man who had just seen a ghost, or perhaps a memory long buried. The ambulance sirens were growing louder, a mournful wail cutting through the night. The stage lights, still blazing, cast long dramatic shadows. And Sebastian was still up in the booth, paralyzed, unable to move, unable to process Caleb's words, unable to shake the image of Julie's eyes meeting mine just before she fell. Or was it her? Caleb's words echoed in the sudden quiet, resonating with a strange, unsettling conviction. It wasn't Julie. But if it wasn't Julie, then who was lying broken on our stage, and why had I not noticed? The questions piled up, cold and heavy, in the pit of my stomach. A foreshadowing of the terrifying, unbelievable truth that was about to unravel and turn my carefully constructed reality on its head. The questions piled up, cold and heavy, in the pit of my stomach. A foreshadowing of the terrifying, unbelievable truth that was about to unravel and turn my carefully constructed reality on its head. The wail of the ambulance sirens grew sharper, slicing through the stunned silence. Paramedics burst through the doors, their green uniforms a stark contrast to the dim theater. Alina was babbling, pointing, crying. Brenda was still on the phone, trying to give coherent details. Caleb, however, remained rooted beside the fallen woman, his hand still on her cheek, his eyes unwavering, an almost ghostly stillness about him. His declaration, "It's not Julie," hung in the air, a bizarre, disorienting echo. I watched, my heart hammering against my ribs as the paramedics took over gently, professionally, their questions quiet, efficient. They checked for a pulse, for respiration, their faces grim. One of them, a stocky man with a no-nonsense demeanor, tried to move Caleb. "Sir, please step back, let us work." Caleb barely registered him, only pulling his hand away reluctantly when the paramedic firmly but gently guided him. They strapped the woman onto a backboard, a neck brace around her throat, and slowly, carefully lifted her onto a stretcher. The shimmering gown, now stained and torn, seemed even more tragic. As they wheeled her past us, her face, pale and still, seemed to twist just for a moment into a fleeting, almost imperceptible grimace, a flicker of awareness, or perhaps just a trick of the stage lights. Alina rushed after them, still sobbing. "Is she going to be all right? Oh God, Julie." Brenda, phone still to her ear, hurried along beside her. I remained in the booth, a silent, useless witness. Caleb, no longer kneeling, stood at the front of the stage, watching the stretcher disappear. He looked like a statue carved from sorrow. A short while later, the theater was silent again, save for the hum of the ventilation system. The police had arrived, a couple of officers asking questions, taking notes. It was an accident, they concluded, a structural failure. But Caleb's words had planted a seed of doubt, a gnawing unease that refused to dissipate. I finally descended from the booth, my legs feeling like lid. Alina and Brenda returned an hour later, their faces ashen. They took her to County General, Alina whispered, her voice hoarse from crying. They said it's severe, head trauma, a broken arm, possibly internal injuries. She shuddered. But something is very strange. She looked at Caleb, who was now sitting quietly in the third row, his gaze fixed on the empty stage. They ID'd her as not Julie. My breath hitched. This was the moment I had dreaded yet half expected. Who is it then? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Brenda, usually so composed, wrung her hands. Her name is Sarah Albright. She's a stagehand from the Regional Theater in Fairmont. Apparently, she's been doing some freelance work picking up odd jobs. Alina added, the hospital staff said she had Julie's ID in her purse and Julie's costume and wig on. My mind reeled. A stagehand dressed as Julie, my guilt, already a heavy cloak, now felt like a lead shroud. I remembered Julie's eyes meeting mine just before the fall. Or had they been Sarah's eyes, wide with sudden panic? The possibility that I had been so utterly blind, so consumed by my own trivial concerns about lighting and schedules, that I hadn't noticed a complete stranger, let alone her presence in a costume, on my asterisk stage was a gut punch. It wasn't just a mistake, it was a profound failure of observation, a dereliction of my duty to ensure safety. And Caleb knew, he had seen it. Why had he not spoken up sooner? Caleb, I said, my voice shaky, how did you know? He slowly turned his head, his deep-set eyes meeting mine. I know Sarah, he said, his voice raspy like dry leaves. She's a good girl, dedicated, but she was in over her head trying to help someone who was manipulative. His gaze flickered towards Alina, then back to me. Julie Murphy wasn't going to show up tonight. She sent Sarah in her place. The revelation was a punch to the gut. Julie, the charming, meticulous Julie, had sent a stand-in for a tech rehearsal. The implications were dizzying. Why? Alina asked, her voice incredulous. Why would she do that? Caleb sighed, a long, weary sound. Because she never intended to perform, not really, not for a long run. He paused, as if gathering his thoughts. Julie Murphy is a professional con artist. She uses community theater, charity events, anything that puts her in a position of perceived vulnerability or artistic integrity to gain trust. She ingratiates herself, collects information, then exploits it. My mind flashed back to Julie's questions, her seemingly genuine interest in everyone's lives, their health, their families. It wasn't charm, it was reconnaissance. But the audition, I stammered, remembering her powerful monologue. It was incredible. Caleb gave a faint, bitter smile. She's an excellent actress, Sebastian. That's her primary talent, the one she hones above all else. She studies her marks, knows what they want to see, what they need to hear. Your theater, with its financial struggles and Alina's ambition, was a perfect target. She played Alina like a fiddle, promising grand success, then used the lead role as leverage for her real scheme. It turned out Julie had been secretly offering exclusive investment opportunities to some of the wealthier patrons and even a few of the more well-off actors, promising astronomical returns on fictional ventures. She had used her role in the play, her artistic integrity, as a cover, a way to establish credibility and gain access. She'd apparently scheduled a significant investment meeting for the very night of the tech rehearsal, one she couldn't miss without raising suspicion. Sarah, a struggling but talented young stagehand who Julie had befriended and subtly manipulated with promises of future roles and a professional breakthrough, had been convinced to stand in for Julie, just for this one critical rehearsal under the guise of an emergency scheduling conflict. Julie had supplied the costume, the wig, and even detailed instructions on how to mimic her movements. Sarah, desperate for a break, had agreed. The irony was devastating. Sarah, playing Julie, had taken the fall for the real Julie's deception. The artistic difference of our previous lead actress suddenly made a lot more sense too. Perhaps Julie had something to do with her departure, orchestrating her own entry. My stomach churned. I had been so easily charmed, so willing to dismiss my unease as mere cynicism, when it was a primal instinct I should have trusted. My guilt deepened further. I had not only been a bystander to an accident, but an unwitting accessory to a deception. 2 weeks later, the theater felt like a morgue. Sarah Albright was still in a coma, her condition critical but stable. The police investigation had expanded, now looking into Julie Murphy's activities. Turns out Caleb wasn't just a quiet observer. He was a retired private investigator specialized in fraud. He had been tracking Julie, or rather, a string of aliases and schemes that led back to her, for months, quietly building a case on behalf of some victims she had swindled in a neighboring state. He hadn't interfered earlier, he explained, because he was gathering irrefutable evidence, waiting for the perfect moment to expose her. The accident, tragic as it was, had provided that moment. He had recognized Sarah instantly, knew it wasn't Julie, and understood the implications. My perception of Caleb transformed completely. From a quirky, lonely old man, he became a figure of quiet competence and moral conviction. He had not only seen through Julie, but he had actively sought justice, a stark contrast to my own passive observations. Alina, meanwhile, was a wreck of shame and disbelief. She felt personally responsible for Sarah's injuries and for being so utterly duped by Julie. She talked about closing the theater, her passion for it extinguished by the cold light of reality. Brenda was furious, dedicating herself to finding the real Julie, not for the theater but for Sarah. I found myself increasingly drawn into Caleb's quiet determination. He wasn't loud, he wasn't accusatory, but his presence was a constant, gentle pressure nudging me towards action. He'd sit with me after the others left, just talking not about the case but about responsibility, about the things we choose to see and the things we ignore. Sometimes, Sebastian, he'd said one evening, his eyes on the broken staircase, still cordoned off with yellow tape, the biggest lies are the ones we tell ourselves about our own capabilities, our own blindness. His words stung, but they were true. I had seen the wobbles in the staircase, warned Alina, then accepted her dismissal. I had seen the charm offensive from Julie, felt the unease, but had been disarmed by her flattery. My inaction was a form of complicity. I decided then and there that I wouldn't be a guilty bystander anymore. I had to help Caleb. I began going through all the theater's records, cross-referencing names, addresses, looking for any pattern, any connection that might help Caleb's case. I found a few small discrepancies, unusual addresses listed for some of Julie's friends who had mysteriously disappeared after a few investment meetings. They weren't much, but Caleb followed every lead with meticulous patience. A month had passed since the accident. Sarah was still unconscious, her parents had arrived, their faces etched with despair. The Whispers of the Gilded Age production was indefinitely postponed, the Lamplight players now shrouded in a pall of scandal and sorrow. But something else was stirring. Caleb and I, along with Brenda, had become a quiet, determined force. Caleb, using my small bits of information and his own extensive network, had managed to track Julie Murphy to an exclusive health retreat upstate, ironically enough called the Serenity Sanctuary. She was apparently orchestrating a new, more elaborate scam, posing as a philanthropic investor looking to fund alternative therapies. Her new persona was one of calm, empathetic wisdom, a healer, utterly unlike the dramatic ingenue. This was Julie's true nature, Caleb explained, not a specific identity but a fluid, adaptable chameleon, always seeking out environments where trust was paramount and vulnerabilities could be exploited. My growth began subtly through the sheer act of working alongside Caleb. He was methodical, patient, and utterly devoid of ego. He never chastised me for my past inaction, only encouraged my present efforts. I started to see the theater not just as a place of technical challenges, but as a crucible for human drama where moral choices played out, not just scripted lines. I re-examined the staircase, not just for its physical flaws, but for what its shoddy construction represented about our collective complacency. I meticulously documented every flaw, every design compromise, not to assign blame, but to understand the systemic issues that led to the accident. I realized that my technical expertise could be applied to more than just fixing props. It could be used to build a stronger, more accountable foundation for the theater, and perhaps for my own life. Alina, seeing my renewed purpose, found a flicker of her own. We started making plans for a complete overhaul of the theater's safety protocols, using Sarah's accident as a grim but vital lesson. This wasn't about staging a play anymore. It was about rebuilding trust, both within our small community and within myself. The climax came not with a dramatic chase, but with a quiet, strategic confrontation orchestrated by Caleb. He informed the authorities, providing his meticulously gathered evidence, and they moved in on Julie at the Serenity Sanctuary. I wasn't there, but Caleb relayed the details. She didn't resist. When confronted with the sheer volume of evidence, the detailed accounts from her victims, and the knowledge of Sarah Albright's condition, Julie Murphy, the manipulative charmer, completely transformed. Not into a remorseful figure, but into something far more chilling, a woman utterly devoid of the elaborate mask she had worn. She shed her persona like a discarded costume, revealing a cold, calculating emptiness. She simply became Julie, a woman facing the consequences of her actions, stripped bare of all her artifice. She admitted to everything, not with regret, but with a detached analysis of her errors in judgment and miscalculations. This complete transformation was her undoing. She could no longer hide behind her charming characters. The persona was gone, and with it, her power. The police took her away. Caleb, finally able to close his long-standing case, expressed a quiet satisfaction. Justice, he said, was rarely dramatic, but it was always necessary. The aftermath was long and difficult. Sarah Albright slowly began to recover, a grueling process of physical therapy and speech rehabilitation. She remembered little of the accident itself, but the recovery was a testament to her resilience. The Lamplight players, under Alina's renewed leadership and my own meticulous oversight, underwent a radical transformation. We held community meetings, openly discussed the fraud in the accident, and sought to rebuild trust. We focused on local talent, on smaller, more intimate productions, emphasizing authentic connection over grand spectacle. I became not just the technical director, but a staunch advocate for safety, transparency, and ethical conduct. My guilt, though it never entirely vanished, transformed into a driving force for positive change. I had been a bystander, but I wouldn't be one again. Caleb Williams, his mission accomplished, stayed on as an unofficial advisor, his quiet wisdom a grounding presence. He saw the theater now not as a place for his investigations, but as a place of genuine healing and community. He shared stories of his past cases, not to boast, but to teach, to illustrate the subtle ways deception could take root. The grand spiral staircase was dismantled, piece by painstaking piece, its splintered steps a vivid, permanent reminder of what can happen when appearances supersede reality. In its place, we built a simpler, sturdier set piece designed for functionality and safety, a symbol of our new foundation. The final scene of Whispers of the Gilded Age was never performed as intended. Instead, months later, we staged a benefit concert for Sarah, a celebration of her progress, a heartfelt apology from the community, and a pledge to do better. I stood in the wings, watching the performers, my eyes no longer fixated on technical perfections, but on the genuine connections between the actors, the audience, and the quiet dignity of a community striving to heal. The stage lights still seared my eyes, but now they illuminated not just the performance, but the profound complexities of human character, the subtle interplay of light and shadow in our own lives, and the enduring, if sometimes painful, journey towards truth. My original self, the passive Sebastian, had indeed been shattered by that sickening thud, but from the fragments, something stronger, more aware, and actively engaged had begun to emerge. The moral rot had been cleansed, replaced by the bitter but clarifying taste of responsibility and redemption.